All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to have everybody here. I wanted to let you know that this is the third installment of the Muir Project's webinar series, Understanding the Science. It's a webinar series that does a deep dive into the newest and most relevant science on topics such as wildfire, ecology, biology, different biodiversity factors, and much more to the public in a universally digestible manner. We're trying to bring some heavy level science and bring it to a way that everybody can understand. And on this episode of Biodiversity in the Burn, I am joined with today with my co-moderator, Jennifer Mamola of the Muir Project for today's presentation. And then I also have with us some of the most incredible and inspiring and wonderful experts in their fields here with us to guide us through the beauty and the wonder of our snag forest habitats. So I wanted to quick talk about the process and how we're going to do things today. The webinar is going to be split up into multiple parts. It'll be 3 parts total, with each of our presenters having about a 10-minute presentation, followed by a specific Q&A to that presenter on their topic. Then at the end of everyone's presentations, we'll have a full panel Q&A for about 20 minutes. And we ask that you submit all of your questions into the chat box, and we will answer those to the best of our ability. And then I always like to let everybody know at the end of today's webinar, if there's any questions that weren't answered, we catalog them, we write them down, and then we include a written response in our follow-up materials, as well as sending out the recording of today's webinar so that you have that for your records. And so we had already kind of talked about this, but just reiterating, at the beginning of today's webinar, you should have had 2 polling questions, 2 or 3, I believe, about your scientific background and your experience with wildfire. And we do this to keep to tailor our discussions and to keep mindful respect for everyone's experiences. So if at any time, if you were to have experience in a wildfire and anything that is kind of triggering for you, please message me privately, and we will try to keep that in mind and, tailor the discussion to accommodate those requests. But with all of that out of the way, let me introduce today's wonderful panelists. I have the poet laureate, filmmaker with a master's in wildlife ecology and toxicology, Miss Maya Khosla from Sonoma County. Dr. Monica Bond is actually here with us from Spain, and she is the wildlife biologist and principal scientist at the Wild Nature Institute. She's not from Spain, she's visiting there right now, but I'm very jealous of her. And then we also have Dr. Chad Hanson, the principal forest and fire ecologist here at the Muir Project. And so with that, I think we're ready to go. So Maya, would you please help us understand the science? Take us away.
Thanks so much. It looks like I have, 10 minutes. I don't want to go over. I want to respect everyone's time. So I'm going to start a little watch here. And if you hear chimes, it means I went too long, which I'm hoping I don't. And I'm going to quickly share some slides. I hope I can share the screen. MC, if you don't mind unmuting and just letting me know if you can see the slide.
You are good to go.
Okay, thank you. That's a mountain bluebird male feeding a little chick in its nest. It's in a snag up in Plumas County. After the Wheeler fire, I had gone out there with Chad, actually. In fact, this photo was taken with Chad. So I want to share just many different examples. I'm going to skim through very quickly because this is all photos, snapshots of representing many hours out there in the field. This is area of Sonoma County, Annandale State Park, that actually burned in the 2017 Sonoma Complex fires. If that little there's a little chick who's an orange beak in that slide, and if that little chick had closed its beak and went to sleep, that would look like a part of, it was so perfectly blended in for this little western wood pewee, and right there in the heart of a snag forest, in the open, but hidden in plain sight. One of my favorites, which is where we started work, research, is the black-backed woodpecker, which you can hear about and probably have heard about, and I'm sure some of you have seen them if you've gone out into post-fire forests. they're perfectly blended in and just sort of completely amazingly evolved. You can see it's bringing out a pretty large wood-boring beetle larva, which is its favorite part of its diet, I'm sure, because that's where we see them go over and over and bring them back home to their chicks. That's another close-up. I actually filmed it, and this area was a snag forest in Stanislaus. I'm sort of skimming from forest to forest. The previous one was Inyo. This is Stanislaus, which is also where blackback woodpeckers are. This chick tends to get really loud, and sometimes, you know, if I'm recording for a number of hours, I'm maybe 100 feet away or 75 feet away, I still pretty much put on my earplugs if I'm recording all day. And that's the dad coming in to feed the same chick in the Stanislaus. As you can see, sometimes blackbacks will use, this is a lodgepole pine tree with a snag with a cavity in it, and they're just so visible on that beautiful gold bark. But unfortunately, that also makes them subject to prey. So they really do prefer those. Well, they really do. They're really successful in those charcoal black snag forests. I was happy to witness this scene with the male. Actually, the male blackback in the center, the parent, is feeding the female chick, and the male to the right, chick to the right, gets real mad. And in a few moments from this moment, in Stanislaus National Forest, the male, the brother, flushes the sister. Hey, I don't want you to be fed, I want to be fed, kind of thing. Also, this is in Yosemite National Park, and white-headed woodpeckers also love the same habitat. And this is also a snag, but it's not quite as charcoaly. Northern flickers also in the burn in another patch really close to that western wood pewee nest. Nuthatches, western bluebirds. This is a nest of a western. There's another mountain bluebird. This is in Sierra National Forest. And now, you know, what's really interesting is the snag forests end up supporting incredible diversity of chaparral nesting species. This is a green-tailed towhee, and you can see from its little chest that it's probably sitting on eggs at this point. It's right in the middle of the nesting season in Inyo National Forest. Western tanager, which Dr. Hado, who started a lot of these wonderful post-fire monitoring studies and surveys, calls this a firebird. And I just don't even need to explain beyond the fact that this bird really does come back into these post-fire snag forest habitats. An unusual addition, great gray owl. This is the great gray owl chicks that I monitored for a little while up in Stanislaus. And of course, as you can see from the background there, they're using a charred snag. It's the top of the snag with the little, you know, sort of semi-cavity, very nice sheltered space in there. They both fledged successfully, and I documented that. That's the parent. Also, as you can see from the backdrop, that's parent is hunting using a snag perch. Spotted owls in a slightly area slightly north of the other sightings of great gray owls, and this of course is more an inner forest species rather than great grays that use the edges. Goshawk, I'm so happy to have documented this goshawk and the chicks that were actually in the previous photo very small, and here they're growing up and fighting quite a bit. That's why they're turning their backs to each other. I saw this is right in the middle of a snag forest. You can see the green. It's a green sort of moderate intensity burn patch, a nice little grove, very quiet, beautiful little grove, completely surrounded by snag forests and hillsides. And they're turning their backs to each other because they're fighting over what the chick on the right has something and the others want it, but he's very aggressive. She is very aggressive. And so they're turning their backs to him so that their heads won't get pecked. I've also been more recently documenting mammals. And so most of my footage ends up being nighttime footage because, of course, a lot of mammals like mountain lions. This one looks like an older, very big mountain lion. Came by my camera several times. They just, of course, they're nocturnal. They can be diurnal too. They can use habitats during the day, but this is a snag forest habitat really close to a creek. This one, it's an interesting, this is a ringtail cat. Ringtail is a species of special concern. Amazing little animal, very adept at using cavities within snag forests. And this one is chewing up the place with the knot of where the pine needles meet, you know, that little tiny little bit of meat. It was very meticulously chewing that up. That's a little weasel. That's not as great a photograph. It's pretty distant, the long-tailed weasel, also using a snag forest. This is my first, when you're lucky, the animals come in during the day. And so I have had some luck with documenting beautiful rare animals in snag forests. And as you can see, this one was freshly born. This is Dixie Fire. It was just taken a few months ago, and this fisher looks pretty young, but to my eyes at least. But there you go. One of the rarest animals in California, right there in the heart of the post-fire forest. Another one, this is a much older burn, the rim 2013 rim fire. You can see the tree to the right, a large tree to the right. It's still alive. It's actually, and it's all charred up. So this is right in the heart of the rim fire, but also it's not, it's right near the creek. So it's not like a high intensity patch, but it is surrounded on the ridge lines by high intensity patches, and they're all close by. So this guy was seen coming and going from those areas. You know, again, not sure if they're using it, but foxes love the snag forest. Several years later, the snags tend to bleach out after they fall, and then just all that charcoal comes off. And bobcats. This is a larger bobcat. This is a little one in my friend Jean Hegland's land. Novelist Jean Hegland allowed me to put some cameras in her property after the 2020 Walbridge fire. Of course, we have beautiful deer. This one fell off while he was foraging, but he continued to forage. He's just fine. And baby and mother black bear, which looks very cinnamony, but and another pretty much newborn bear. I think I'm going to end there because I'm pretty much running out of time. So thanks so much. I'll stop my screen sharing right now, just giving you some glimpses of the snag forest. Cancel. Are we back here?
We are back. Thank you, Maya.
Okay, good. Thanks so much.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, and your photographs are wonderful. I absolutely love them. We have a couple questions here. Craig just made a comment. Charles Little wrote a wonderful book on the dying of trees and how logging tips the natural balance within nature. That I'm sure is a very, very good read. But I wanted to pose to you then, Maya, two questions here. What would you say is like the biggest struggle as a biologist and filmmaker that you run into when trying to get this type of footage? Is it, you know, permits? Is it location? Is it a combination of those things? Is it just the patience? Like, tell us about that process a little bit.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so now that I'm focusing mostly on mammals, it's a lesson in patience for sure. And I think with some of them, I'm unclear about, you know, mostly we are allowed to just leave a camera in place. And sometimes you just want to make sure. And so up in Lassen, I do have a permit for Lassen National Park. It's pretty amazing. I haven't checked my cameras yet. So, but the wolf's back, etc. So with that kind of thing, with a really sensitive animal, if you end up close by it, it's actually good to have a permit. That can sometimes be a bit of a hurdle because, you know, it's just a stepping stone, and the powers that be are maybe not really, they're sort of, it takes time for trust to build, a lot of time, sometimes too much time. And then the other thing is that sometimes when I put my cameras out in the National Forest System, I'll see signs where the snags are marked with blue chalk or blue paint, and that means they're going to come down. And so I'm sort of semi-frantic most of the time, thinking, well, what if my what if the snag or tree where I put my camera comes down? And you know, naturally is fine. I've actually last year recorded, I had a camera 2 feet away from a snag that fell naturally in a high wind, and it was amazing because I can slow motion it and get that drama. But when it's actually logging, then it's sort of very, very sort of comprehensive cutting, and snags don't naturally do that anyway. It's sort of, and also the tree that I'm put my camera on might not be seen and might just be logged, and so my camera might be smashed, and the sort of expensive camera. So
yeah. Awesome. And then another question is, how long do you think it takes for a community of birds or mammals or anything to use an area for either nesting or hunting for it then to be established or designated in a way that we could protect it? Would you have an idea about that?
I'm sorry, how long does it?
So as like, the question was posed, how long does it take for a community of animals to use an area for either nesting or hunting for it to be established or designated for protection?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, you know, so that fissure, the Dixie was, by the way, I have to thank Ralph Bloomer. He's here. I saw that he's attending. He's been so amazing and helpful with establishing my connection up at Lassen, you know, with Fish and Wildlife and others. Now with Lassen National Park to get the permits. So thank you so much. It takes a village, I tell you, to do this. But yeah, it does. You know, sometimes with that fissure up there in Lassen, that was a few months later. Yeah, he just came right back in, and that's there's a beautiful grove. It's a campsite, actually. I'm not going to name anything because I'm not supposed to give you locations. Oops, I almost did. Anyway, so it's a very beautiful area, and I can imagine he would want to investigate this area, but he was quite comfortable coming right back. I would say protection right away. Okay. Blackbacks come in. I've seen blackbacks coming in within a few months. Great grays are very, they have high sight fidelity like spotted owls probably. But so the great grays, I don't know when they came back, but there's a publication by Rodney Siegel et al. That said 21 out of the 22 great gray owl territories that they examined before the fire were there. 21 were there after the fire. I mean, you can imagine, you know, they didn't say the number of years, but I would imagine like in the year after, it's in this case, it's in the year, they're just using a snag, so they'll come right back. Is my imagination on that.
Awesome. Oh, there's the cat making an appearance. Ready. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Maya. I really, really appreciate it. And I think we will move on to Monica. Take it away, Monica.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maya, for taking us on that journey through post-fire forests. There we go. Is that showing right there? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to be focusing my talk today on spotted owls and snag forests. Okay. So the spotted owl is one of the most famous inhabitants of our western old growth forest.
What's that?
Doug, you need to mute yourself.
Is there something?
I think you need to mute. If you were playing a while. Doug? Okay.
Doug?
Hey, Doug, I think you need to mute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, we're all set? All right,
We're all
let's start
set.
again.
There we go.
Here we go. Okay. But spotted owls are in danger of extinction because about 90% or more of the old growth forest that existed when Europeans began colonizing Western North America has been lost, mostly due to logging by the timber industry. And logging continues in occupied spotted owl habitat to this day. So one thing I want to point out and highlight is that for people who have followed the stories about spotted owls over the years, may have noticed that when owls were first listed under the Endangered Species Act in the early 1990s, logging was identified as the clear culprit for their population declines. But more recently, however, habitat loss and degradation from logging has been de-emphasized. And most people now want to focus on barred owls and wildfire as the reason that spotted owls are not recovering. But there's plenty of scientific evidence now that fire is not a primary threat and can actually benefit spotted owls. Yet most forest managers continue to say that forests need to be logged to save the owls from fire, even though logging remains the dominant reason the species is near extinction and not recovering. So Western forests almost always burn as a near equal mix of low, moderate, and high severity fire. Maybe only about 30% of any given forest fire burns at high severity, and often even less. But this severely burned forest is a very rare and super biodiverse habitat. Government agencies and the timber industry routinely misrepresent how our fire-adapted forests work, and they dismiss the rich biodiversity that's born and maintained by severe forest fire. Why is this? Because it's not convenient to their desire to cut down trees for money. Human homes and communities are most effectively saved by retrofitting houses and maintaining resistance to ignition, not by logging in our forests. So I'm just going to begin with what happens when a forest burns. Wood-boring beetles are the first to show up in a severely burned forest. They come before the fire's even out, and they're so adapted to fire that they have special sensory organs that can sense smoke or heat from miles away. They flock from the surrounding areas to lay their eggs in the freshly dead trees, and their millions of larvae then feed under the bark. After the high severity fires burned out, you have standing dead trees, fallen logs, resprouting shrubs and tree seedlings, and lots of flowers. And all of these elements provide critical food and shelter for a high diversity of animals. The beetle larvae are valuable food for the next fire-loving animals to come along into the snag forest, which are woodpeckers. Woodpeckers eat the huge fat beetle larvae, which Maya showed in some of her images, and those larvae remain inside the dead trees for years. The woodpeckers come in for all of the great food, and they also make lots of nesting holes in dead trees. So other birds can nest in those holes. And these are birds that can't make their own holes. And some examples are bluebirds, house wrens, nuthatches, and kestrels. There's also lots of native wildflowers and fungi that are only seen after a high severity fire. Regrowing shrubs and flowers support a superabundance of insects, which brings in aerial insectivores like olive-sided flycatchers and lots of bats. And this fresh new shrubs also feed deer and elk. So you get a boom of rodents like deer mice and gophers in there as well. And this small mammal boom is what brings in predators like fishers and spotted owls. When I began studying spotted owls 23 years ago, which was last century, back in 1999 is when I started, like many other owl scientists, I also presumed severe fire was harmful to owls in the forest. But I've since completely changed my mind in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary. Oops. The science has shown that spotted owls generally survive, occupy, and reproduce in burn sites at rates similar to green sites. Owls prefer to hunt in severely burned forests that are near to their nests, and they eat lots of gophers. So spotted owls like forests with lots of medium and large trees, whether those trees are alive or have been burned in a fire. The natural mix of different burn severities in forests with plenty of large trees provides quality habitat for spotted owls. So the burned forests are like the kitchen where they can forage for their food, and the unburned or lightly burned forests are the bedroom and the nursery where they can sleep and raise their young. Unfortunately, it's common practice to cut down forests after they've burned. And this is called salvage logging, or its euphemism, forest restoration. When trees are cut down, either in unburned or burned forest, this is what harms spotted owls. And sure enough, the science has shown that post-fire salvage logging causes spotted owls to abandon their breeding sites. In 2018, my colleague, Dr. Derek Lee, compiled all of the published research that has ever been done by every scientist up to that point about spotted owls in wildfires. And he did a statistical meta-analysis to examine the effects of fire. Overall, the only significant effects of high severity fire on spotted owls were actually positive effects on recruitment and positive effects on reproduction. There were no significant negative effects of any kind. So overall, there really isn't any basis to say that fuels reduction logging is necessary to save owls from fire. Since the publication of the meta-analysis in 2018 and a follow-up meta-analysis published in 2020 that showed the exact same results, Dr. Lee and Dr. Chad Hanson, who's here in this seminar today, and we analyzed every published study that showed a negative effect of high severity fire on spotted owls. Every single one of those 13 studies, with the exception of one, was confounded by post-fire logging that had taken place within the core of the spotted owl breeding site. The one study that did not have post-fire logging in the core of the breeding site did have post-fire logging just outside the breeding site. So to reiterate, there was not a single study that showed negative effects of severe fire that did not have post-fire logging somewhere within and around the owl's home. This demonstrates very clearly that research needs to be conducted in unlogged habitats to best understand the dynamics of fire and spotted owls. So what does this mean for forest management? It means that wildfire itself is not a major threat to spotted owl populations when the owls have good quality unlogged habitat that supports breeding pairs. The major threat to spotted owls has been and continues to be logging of both green and burn trees. Some studies have shown that there may be some negative effect of fire in lower quality owl habitats. And these are areas that are occupied ephemerally by single owls. So they're not always occupied, and they tend to be occupied just by single owls. But we also know that the negative effects of salvage logging are much greater than any negative effects of fire. And that fire clearly also benefits reproduction and recruitment. And the fact is, we don't have control over high severity fire, but fortunately, we do have control over whether or not we decide to chop down trees. And clearly the science shows that we should not log our forests if we care about protecting spotted owls. So my recommendation based on the science is to stop logging our public forests, facilitate pro-forestation to maximize mature forest for spotted owls, and then when that forest burns, leave the burned forest intact for owls to forage in. The fundamental message from the scientific research is that severe fire creates essential habitat for bats and birds and beetles and mice and flowers and mushrooms. And even old forest species like spotted owls can exploit conditions created by severe fires. There's no good fire or bad fire, which is a message that we often see. Big hot fires have burned in our Western forest for thousands and thousands of years and are as vital to the forest ecosystem as rain or snow. And the many fire adapted species are telling us an important story about their coevolution with severe fire. And we just need to listen to them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Monica. That was great. I wanted to throw a question at you here. If you could maybe give us a couple examples of fires that you've personally, or areas that you've personally been involved with, and where the Forest Service said that spotted owls wouldn't be there because of fire, and that you've prevented potentially from post-fire logging itself.
Okay, that's a good question. So I started studying spotted owls, like I said, in 1999. I worked in the El Dorado and Tahoe National Forest on a spotted owl demography study where we were banding the owls and reciting them and looking at reproductive rates and survival rates. And then in 2001, the Star Fire burned in that area. And in fact, this image behind me is a picture of Duncan Canyon, which is part of that Star Fire. And this is actually still supports, this area behind me supports a pair of spotted owls to this very day. And thanks to Chad, this is when I started getting involved in reading some of the Forest Service documentation about post-fire logging projects. Chad and I visited this site, and I worked with Chad and Rachel to try to stop the salvage logging in the Star Fire. And I think this is the roadless area that we ended up getting protected. Chad, correct me if I'm wrong. And so, of course, this I had been working on spotted owls before that. And at this time, we didn't really know that much about spotted owl habitat selection and how they use burn forests, because most of the research that had been conducting on spotted owls to date had been in forests that were long unburned. I don't like to say unburned forests because that's not true. Forests have burned at some time in their past, right? So I say long unburned forests. So most of the habitat models where we say, oh, they like old growth forests with high canopy cover and large trees and this kind of thing. That was just based on studies that were done in long unburned forests. And we didn't know how they used burn forests. And after reading the Forest Service documentation on the Star Fire, I started saying, well, maybe we need to start studying that and learning a bit more about how owls use burn forests. So that piqued my interest and began a long career in studying owls in burn forests. And I then worked in, I did a study in the McNally fire, which burned in 2002, and I did the research in 2006. So it was 4 years after the fire. I captured owls and put radios on them and tracked them. And in this area, they had access to different kinds of burn severity. So each owl that I radio collared could forage either and nest or roost in areas that hadn't burned, all the way up to areas that were severely burned. And what we found was rather surprising, that they actually preferred to forage in the severely burned forest sites that were closest to their nests and roosts. It surprised even me how much they like to use these burned forests. And then when we analyzed their regurgitated pellets, we found they were eating a lot of gophers, which actually tend not to be in older forests, but in more open areas. So, and also I want to mention, thanks to Chad and Rachel, this McNally fire, they stopped the logging in that fire, which allowed me to do this research. And otherwise it would have been confounded by a lot of salvage logging. So that was great. And then I did, been involved in looking at owl occupancy rates throughout all the fires in the Sierra Nevada. I visited different fire sites, one of them most prominently being the Rim Fire, and I've gone back year after year since then. I actually analyzed Forest Service survey data from that Rim Fire, and I looked at the year immediately following the fire. It was a really awesome study area because there were more than 40 spotted owl sites, spotted owl territories in the Rim Fire. And the Forest Service had done sort of some surveys before that, but then after the fire, right after the fire, they had done surveys in all of those sites. And so I requested those data and I analyzed and found higher rates of occupancy after the Rim Fire, 1 year after the Rim Fire, higher than even studies that were done in unburned areas. So It was extremely high occupancy, probably because the habitat there was really good. And like I mentioned in the talk, if they have really good habitat and there's lots of breeding pairs, then high severity fire doesn't have an adverse effect on them, and in fact can benefit reproduction and recruitment. And I don't want to make this into a negative talk, but very unfortunately, the Rim Fire was then logged, and it was extremely frustrating because this would have been an amazing area if the Forest Service had not salvage logged and continued to do long-term research. Without salvage logging, we could have really learned a lot about how owls use burned forests and the severely burned forests, because there were so many sites in that one fire, more than 45, and there was really high occupancy. So we could have looked a little bit more long-term, but the Forest Service ruined that opportunity, unfortunately. So that's, and I also did some analysis of owls in Southern California, both radioed owls and just occupancy rates in forests in Southern California. Awesome. Based on data collected by the Forest Service. And I'm continuing to this day. Right now, I'm analyzing some northern spotted owl data from the Forest Service and looking at how fire and salvage logging and pre-fire logging and barred owls affect occupancy rates.
Great. Well, I have one more question for you before we pass it over to Chad. And this one is about California, or the northern spotted owl specifically, not the other two subspecies that you do work with. But I think it was 1990 that the California spotted owl was originally listed as endangered, and now it is no longer. And I was kind of just interested on your take about why Fish and Wildlife and also the Forest Service are hesitant or just unable to label them as endangered as they clearly are, because we do know that they're running into the threat of extinction currently.
Okay, so there's 3 subspecies of spotted owls. There's the northern, which occurs from southern British Columbia all the way down through the Cascades and the coastal ranges of Oregon, Washington, Oregon, and then to northern California, all the way down to the Northern Bay Area, across to the northern part of the Sierra Nevada. And then there's the California spotted owl from about the Pitt River down to the Sierra Nevada and in Southern California, and then the Mexican spotted owl, which is in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, a little bit of Texas. And it's kind of these like isolated insular areas in different mountain ranges. So the California spotted owl is not listed as an endangered, or none of them are listed as an endangered species. They're listed as threatened species, and it's only the northern spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl. And the California spotted owl was petitioned several times for listing as an endangered or threatened species, and it has not been listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's various reasons, maybe because of one of the big reasons that often is cited is that there's these voluntary efforts to, have habitat conservation plans and things like this, and that might be a reason why not to list it. But I think that the California spotted owl most recent listing petition was warranted. This sort of legal stuff, maybe Chad can answer better than me, where the legal status is of the listing for the California spotted owl at the moment.
Awesome.
Chad, do you know what's?
Yeah, short answer is California spotted owl listing as threatened is under review again. So there's reason for some hope that Fish and Wildlife Service finally may list the California spotted owl under the Endangered Species Act. There have been multiple efforts over a couple of decades to list the California spotted owl. Fish and Wildlife has always refused. In my view, it's political because they're basically looking out for the logging industry more than they're looking out for the species. But hopefully it'll get listed this time.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just point out that to take the northern spotted owl as an example, it was listed as a threatened species in the early 1990s, but unfortunately, because of this fire hysteria, there continues to be logging in northern spotted owl habitat to this day. It had definitely, the listing has done a lot of good. The Northwest Forest Plan kind of was driven by the listing of the owl, and making these late successional reserves has been wonderful. But this sort of threat of fire to owls has unfortunately facilitated logging in critical habitat, even occupied areas for northern spotted owls, because the Forest Service puts forth this misleading idea that we have to log the forest to save owls. And I strongly disagree with that, and really hope that we start changing that policy if we want to save spotted owls, because as Dominic De La Salle always says, they're circling the drain. They're having a really tough time. We continue to log. Barred owls have invaded, and barred owls are exacerbated by, the presence of barred owls is facilitated by logging. So there's a lot going on with the northern spotted owl, but one of the things I think that can really help is by stopping logging the forest that they need to survive.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Monica. And I will then pass it over to our third and final presenter, Dr. Hanson, and take it away, Chad.
Thank you very much. I'll start sharing my screen here. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. All right, so I'm going to focus on the natural forest regeneration following high intensity fire in particular. And I want to focus on that aspect of snag forest habitat because there's a lot of misunderstanding about high intensity fire in particular, not just with regard to wildlife, that misconception that, of course, Maya and Monica dispelled, that fire destroys wildlife habitat. In fact, it actually creates wildlife habitat. But a lot of people, even if they recognize that, they fear that if an area burns at high intensity, it won't regenerate naturally on its own. And that misconception is being used right now by the logging industry and the Forest Service to justify large-scale post-fire logging and artificial planting projects, which of course destroy snag forest habitat. So I want to talk about that issue a little bit because there's good and hopeful news, just as Maya and Monica presented. I have a lot more information on this issue in my book that came out last year, Smoke Screen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. Someone who wants a deeper dive on this, I wrote it for non-scientists, but I have a lot of scientific citations in the endnotes. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the natural forest regrowth and regeneration in snag forest habitat. This is a picture of one of the areas in the Star Fire that Monica talked about a little bit ago, and she and I worked with others to stop this area from being clear cut. And this was actually a spotted owl site. and foraging grounds for spotted owls. And this was a small area we stopped from being logged. Unfortunately, the areas around it were logged. But because this area was not logged or planted, it allowed us to have an opportunity to see, well, what happens with the natural forest regrowth over time if the Forest Service doesn't do what it planned to do. And as you can see, you've got the standing snags, the dead trees, you've got the down logs, which replenish the soil as they decay and replenish and enhance those mycorrhizal fungi networks in the soil, which are so important. You've got the shrubs, you've got dogwoods, you've got regenerating conifers of different species. This wonderful complex ecosystem that we call snag forest habitat. So far from this, from these pejorative terms that we hear in the media, that the logging industry really tries to promote, moonscape and nuked and all these other devastated, destroyed. We hear all these terms, and the reality is that these areas are rejuvenated by fire. Fires are creating habitat, not destroying or taking away habitat. And in order to understand that, it's really key to understand not just the wildlife, but also the post-fire regeneration. Because if nothing regenerated, then you could understand the argument. But that's, of course, not what we see. This is me and Dr. James Hanson, climate scientist in the Rim Fire. This is one of the areas we stopped the Forest Service from post-fire logging. They claimed that this area would not regenerate. They claimed that none of the large high-intensity fire patches would naturally regenerate, or it would take many, many decades, if not centuries, for natural regeneration to begin in these areas. That's what they've been telling the public, and they've been using that narrative to justify post-fire clear cutting and artificial planting of trees. Well, this is an area where we stopped them from post-fire logging, and this is just 8 years post-fire. And here we are last year, and the natural regeneration is over the tops of our heads, way over the tops of our heads. Right next door, the same exact high-intensity fire patch, this area was post-fire logged and planted about 5 years earlier, based on the narrative that it had to be logged and planted in order to recover forest. Forest Service said, if we don't do this, we're never going to get trees back, or it'll take hundreds of years. And this is restoration and fuel reduction. That's what they called this. They actually called it reforestation. And in reality, what we see is the post-fire logging, the logging machinery damaged the fragile post-fire soils. It took away the dead trees, which otherwise would fall and replenish the soil and aid the growth of the regenerating forest. And the post-fire logging machinery actually crushes and kills nearly all of the natural post-fire regeneration, the little seedlings and saplings of conifers, the fir and cedar and pine trees. They get crushed under the treads of the logging machinery. And then when they plant the trees, there's no shade. There isn't that nice mix of sun and shade that you have in the snag forest. Instead, they just bake in the sun, and most of them die. And so while you can see, if you look carefully, a few seedlings and saplings growing here and there, there's not much. They basically deforested this area. And that's really common after post-fire logging. This is another area in the Rim Fire. I took this picture last year. The natural forest regeneration in this area is about 12 feet tall already as of last year. It's even taller now this year. This is all natural regeneration. And this is over 1,000 feet from the nearest live surviving tree. And so this is a long way from the nearest live surviving tree seed source, and yet you have this amazing natural forest regeneration. Well, we know that wind only blows the seeds so far. So how is that possible? Well, it's complex because a forest is not just plants, it's also animals. And the birds and small mammals are dispersing seeds all over the forest every single day on a massive, massive scale. And so the forests don't need us to replant them after fires. They don't need our intervention after fires, even in really large, high-intensity fire patches like this one. This is the deepest interior part of one of the two largest high-intensity fire patches in the entire Rim Fire. And that is the level of natural regeneration that you have at just 8 years post-fire. Just extraordinary. Nice mix of shrubs and pine and fir and cedar. Right next door, same high-intensity fire patch, just literally a stone's throw away. This is the result of post-fire logging and artificial planting. This was done, again, 5 years earlier, and this is what it still looks like. Now what you have is a stump field and invasive cheatgrass, which is brought in by the logging machinery on the treads, and cheatgrass is highly combustible. And so again, these post-fire interventions are not helping the ecology of these areas. They're just destroying important habitat and setting back the regeneration and putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. This is a more recent example in the Rim Fire, where the post-fire logging was done specifically to feed a biomass plant. We call this clear cuts for kilowatts. And again, the natural regeneration, I have pictures of the pre-fire, of the pre-logging regeneration, and it was about 8 or 9 feet tall in here. And of course, this is what you have after the logging. And this is something that's not just limited to mixed conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada. This is true in Loblolly pine forests in southeastern Texas. This is the Bastrop fire that occurred in 2011. This was the large high-intensity fire patch, and this is enormous Loblolly pine natural regeneration just at 3 years post-fire. In many cases, this is already over 20 feet tall in places now. I went there just last year at 10 years post-fire. And this is what it looked like in the same fire, in the same high-intensity fire patch where post-fire logging and planting had occurred. So this is not just in California. This is also, in the southeast where post-fire logging occurs. You have the same negative impact, where it's basically spreading invasive combustible grasses and setting back the natural regeneration. And again, you don't need to plant. The forests are coming back all on their own, just wonderfully. I'm finding the same thing in giant sequoia forests. It turns out giant sequoias regenerate in spectacular fashion after high-intensity fire patches. In fact, they regenerate the best and most abundantly and most rapidly after high-intensity fire than they do after low and moderate intensity fire. And that's true even with 100% shrub cover. You can see in the center of the image there's about 6 giant sequoia saplings. And you can walk through this shrub cover. It's all native fire-following shrubs. And the shrubs, if anything, seem to benefit the giant sequoias. They certainly don't harm them in terms of their generation. And you'll see, even if you don't see them until you get up close, you'll see the giant sequoia seedlings and saplings growing right up through the shrubs. In the low intensity fire areas, in the same fire, giant sequoia reproduction is almost zero. You can find a little bit, but the only places you really find any giant sequoia reproduction in low intensity is right on the edge of a moderate intensity patch. Right in the real low, true low intensity, it's essentially zero. It's close to zero. And one of the key things, and I'm just about to wrap up here, but one key thing that I want to mention is, some folks on the call here might be aware of some studies by Forest Service scientists and university scientists funded by the Forest Service, claiming that there's relatively low conifer regeneration in large high-intensity fire patches in various fires across the West. And they've been promoting this message in the media to promote post-fire logging and artificial planting and promote more subsidies for that. We did a deep dive and looked at this very carefully in a study we published last year. Me and Tanya Chi and Maya was instrumental in a lot of the field work for that, as were others. And what we found is it really comes down to plot size. They use plot sizes, field plots that are so small, they end up with a large percentage of zeros in the field. And when we actually use larger plots, what we find is that the vast majority of these plots, even in the large high intensity fire patches, have natural conifer regeneration. But if you use plots that are so small, you're going to be able to report misleadingly that most of the high severity fire plots have no conifer regeneration, but it's just a function of a methodological error. So I just wanted to put that out there so folks understand and have some caution when they're reading some of these studies by Forest Service scientists. And anyway, this last slide just goes to that question. So I'll stop sharing there and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. That was really great. This first question is from Jerry, and he was asking about fallen trees and the tremendous work that the fungal community does with the rotting trees to strengthen both the fungal network and help feed the small new growing trees. So I think his overall question is like, could you explain that a little bit more? He was wondering if we were going to touch on that. Well,
sure. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it briefly, but I think that that the question itself sort of contains the answer in a way, which is great, because it's exactly right. When the snags fall, those down logs are incredibly important habitat. They're also for small mammals, for invertebrates, but they're also incredibly important in terms of the nutrients they contain. And as they decay, they replenish the soil, and they basically enhance and feed those mycorrhizal fungi networks in the soil, which of course helps the forest grow. And so it's really important to understand that a forest ecosystem is not just the live trees. It's not just the live large trees. It's the small live trees. It's conifers and non-conifers. It's dead trees. It's down logs. It's shrubs and wildflowers. All of that complexity is key. And frankly, the dead trees are such a key component, including the down logs of the ecosystem. It's just really hard to overstate that.
Awesome, thank you. Then we have a question here from Craig about, have you studied the differences between natural versus restored landscapes after a fire, and how long does the restored forest take to regenerate versus natural forest after a fire?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically what we're finding is that natural regeneration tends to be much more effective and efficient at getting live trees back. But of course, it's not just about the live trees, it's also about the snags and the down logs and the shrubs and all the other habitat. And post-fire logging removes most or all of that. And so, but just in terms of the live trees, what I'm finding is that you have better regeneration by far in the areas that are just left alone.
Great. And then from Craig again, with restoration, how much do invasive species impact the landscape versus natural regen?
Could you say that again, MC?
Oh, sure. With restoration, how much does invasive species impact the landscape versus natural regen? So I'm assuming he's referring to the invasive species brought in by restoration projects that happen or are associated with post-fire logging.
Right. Well, yeah, and I would always qualify it by saying the so-called restoration. You know, there's a whole series of these euphemisms, but yeah, I mean, it really hasn't been studied as much, the impact of the invasives on the regeneration. I'm not sure if that was the question, but I think Monica might have a response on this as well.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I was typing an answer to Craig's thing about restored versus natural post-fire forest.
And that is exactly what we're talking about. So you're good.
Okay.
The question that he posed was, with restoration, in quotes, how much do invasive species impact the landscape versus natural regen?
Well, I mean, I think, Chad, if you might have mentioned, some of the invasive plant species and weeds are certainly brought in by logging trucks on the tires of logging trucks and this kind of thing. So yeah, that's very damaging.
Perfect. Awesome.
Yeah. And then I mentioned there's some research done out of Oregon State by Daniel Donato and colleagues looking at in the Biscuit Fire, the regeneration of trees in natural forests that had not been post-fire logged versus logged and then replanted, and found more regeneration in the natural unlogged forest, and that was published in Science.
Awesome. Thank you, Monica. That is really helpful. And then this last question for Chad before we open it back up to our full panel is, do post-fire logs have an economic value in view of Forest Service? Do they burn the post-fire logs with more carbon release? That was from Sally. So I'll say it again one more time. Do post-fire logs have any economic value in the view of the Forest Service? And do they burn the post-fire logs for more carbon release?
Right. Okay, so I'll answer real briefly so we can open up to questions for all three panelists. But bottom line is that the Forest Service wants to do the post-fire logging for economic reasons in the generally first 2 years after fire, because the decay after a tree dies happens sort of slowly. And for about 2 years or sometimes 3, the trees, the dead trees still have enough structural integrity that they can use them for lumber. So that's really what it's about. It's not about restoration. It's not about fuel reduction. It's not about reforestation. They really just want to cut those trees down so they can turn them into lumber. After that, what they're typically doing is clear cutting these areas for biomass. And so after they're no longer usable for lumber because of decay beyond 3 years post-fire, they're clear cutting these areas and using taxpayer subsidies to do it on public lands, and basically selling them for chipping the trees, shipping whole snags, and burning them in biomass facilities, which of course is a climate change nightmare. All that carbon goes into the atmosphere.
Awesome. Alrighty, well then I will open it back up to all three panelists. Again, everybody, if you could please submit your questions for our panelists into the chat, that would be really helpful. I saw Monica seems to have tag teamed Jerry's answer a little bit, but Jerry was reiterating when they clear the salvage area and plant Doug fir plantations, aren't the Doug fir plantations more at risk of fire in hotter temperatures than a naturally restoring mixed forest? And that's a very much resounding yes, I think, from all three panelists.
Yeah, plantations burn hotter. Like single species plantations, they're at risk of disease. They're not very biodiverse. That's a really, really good point. Yeah. Yep. I mean, the forests that are naturally regenerating include seeds from the local area. So they're adapted to that very local area.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. We have another question here about how long does it take for a forest to regenerate after a fire, and does this change depending on severity?
Well, I would love to hear Maya just talk about all of your experience in the high intensity fire patches and the rim fire with regard to that question, just because you've spent so many field hours in these areas.
How long does it take for the forest to regenerate?
Yeah, does that change
yeah,
the severity?
Within the high severity patch, right?
Yeah.
Mostly. Yeah, I mean, we took a lot of, there was a Forest Service grid that was laid down for, to amply represent areas that could or could not come back after the wildfire. I do have to mention one thing though, that they had plots in the middle of creeks, in the middle of oaks, woodlands, in the middle of chaparral, in the middle of roads. And so those areas, if you use those areas to try to represent conifer regeneration that never had a history, like, well, maybe the roads did, but once upon a time before they were roads. So it was impossible to, those were not plots. We just sort of looked at them and said, well, we better move on from here. So, but then when we went to the plots where, there was conifer regen, first of all, I think that study was done, in all fairness, they must have been wanting all amped up to try to assess right away. But then if you wait a couple of years, and even now, there's tiny little seedlings growing even this year. So the more it's almost like the more you wait, there's a time factor with the regen study. But we did it probably, I think, was year 4 or 5, and it was unbelievable. If you crawl through that chaparral, there were little seedlings, higher seedlings. There was some things coming to my shoulders at that time, a little bit, 1 or 2 over my head. So if we counted, we started with the 10 meter, 5, 10, and then 25, I think is what I recall. But if you went to 25, I mean, just every single time you would find conifer regen. It was sort of not even a question. And then there was some areas that was skipped along the grid or not really well represented along the grid. And then Chad had added those areas, just to sort of be a little more well-rounded. And that was astounding. It was just, the results were just astounding to me, when you looked at it at scale, that, right here we go in the middle of this high severity patch. All over again, you're seeing so much conifer regen. And of course we were including the little guys as well. Got a little attached to them. Hi, little guy, here you are again, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, have to say.
Oh, wonderful.
Can I just point out, there are unique community of species, native species, that will use every successional stage of the forest after fire, from year 1 after the fire to year 100. As it first, it's just, like the shrubs and the new flowers and things like this, and the seedlings are really small. There's species that need that kind of habitat. And then, 5-10 years later, the saplings are getting taller, species that use that, 15. And, as things are regrowing, there's every single one of those successional stages is important to a unique community of species in our forest.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here from Spencer, and then I'll follow up with Craig's question. Spencer asks, what are the panel's brief thoughts on efforts to non-commercially thin small diameter trees and shrubs in the wildland urban interface, so the WUI, often promoted as community protection? So I will pitch that to our panelists.
Well, I think we probably all have thoughts on this. I'm happy to offer a couple first, but unless Maya or Monica would like to address it first.
No, go ahead.
All right. Well, it's a really important question, and I think, and I bottom line is the science is really clear that if you focus on homes and the immediate vicinity around homes in terms of protecting them from fire, that's where the effectiveness is. It's really not out in the wildlands. So 2 key things. It comes down to terminology. Really, it's about what happens with the home itself in terms of fireproofing it, and with 100 feet around the home. And it's really just pruning, it's not logging. And we really call that the defensible space zone. So I've stopped using the term wildland urban interface, the WUI term. And the reason I've stopped using it is that it's been so badly abused. I mean, the Forest Service will define that as 2 miles, 3 miles, 1.5 miles around any kind of community, and they define community very broadly. There's a little campsite with an outhouse and a couple of picnic benches. That becomes a community, and sometimes they put 1.5 mile radius around that. It's been abused, and so really, and also the term small trees. What's a small tree? Well, the general public has an idea of what a small tree is. They think seedlings and saplings. When the Forest Service uses that term, beware. When they say small, they mean trees up to 24 inches in diameter. So that only 1% of the trees in the forest are larger than that. And so it's kind of being done with a wink and a nod. And we really just need to focus on homes. The homes themselves and 100 feet around the homes.
Yep, I agree.
So yeah, I just posted something from Bernie Klaus's Soundscapes. This is more on the line of biodiversity, and where thinning, is so far from homes, it's really irrelevant. So I'd like to draw your attention to four minutes, 20 seconds of his talk. This is something Jen Mamola sent me a while ago, and it's just incredibly impressive. He took the trouble to get out there to Tahoe National Forest, and I think got permission to do sound recordings, and he's got us all this technical equipment. I wish I had right before the thinning operations, and then right after, and then maybe a few years after. So you will hear his plea in this talk. It's an amazing talk, and then he has these graphics to show the soundscape. You can hear it, of course, but it's amazing because, he's really graphically presenting the soundscape before the thinning operations. It sounds like an enthusiastic orchestra, and then after the thinning, it's very subdued. Yeah, I mean, it's like night and day. So just from a biodiversity standpoint, I have noticed for years silenced forests. So from my standpoint, you don't get goodie points for biodiversity. Either you're going to thin it and lose the biodiversity, or don't thin it and keep it. But you don't get to thin it and call it supporting biodiversity. That you can't have your cake and eat it, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, so this is such an amazing little segment from something Jen sent out recently. Please look at it.
Thank you. And we will definitely include that into our follow-up materials with everybody as well. I have a quick question, just a personal one for the panelists. Because you all have such expansive experience out in the field, if you had to pick a favorite species, which would it be that you've studied or worked with?
I'm not going to go first on that one.
I love the spotted owl. I mean, I also studied blackback woodpeckers and seen a lot, seen a lot out there, but I really do just absolutely adore the spotted owl.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. I mean, unless you're talking about giraffes and other things I study too, but that doesn't work here.
I mean,
I would have a hard
for me,
time.
I would say I would have to ask a question. How much time do I have?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. I would have a hard time picking a favorite. I really would. I mean, I've studied blackback woodpeckers and Pacific fishers and spotted owls in post-fire habitat, and also lots of other, woodpecker species and bird species that are not as famous and people don't know as well. Hairy woodpeckers and white-headed woodpeckers and others. And honestly, sometimes my favorite ones are just these little nondescript grayish birds that hardly anyone even knows about. That I just think are really, really cool and beautiful. Nesting in the shrubs and they're not particularly charismatic from the standpoint of the general public, but I think they're beautiful.
Oh, wonderful. Awesome. Well, then I will throw, we have a question from Craig, excuse me, not from Chad. And then Patricia's question, we'll do, Craig had said, I had heard in a previous webinar, talk about the biscuit fire, that 1/2 to 2/3 of the fire was the consequence of backburns. Who is studying this as to whether our firefighting increases it or is marginally effective? It seems once again that that management is a problem. So I think if we had to sum it up to one question is, who's studying this? Who's studying the consequences of backburns and whether or not our firefighting increases or is marginally effective?
Yeah, some great work is being done, kind of watchdogging the backburn abuses by Fusey, Tim Inglesby's group, and they've got some great reports on that issue, including biscuit fire.
Awesome. And then we have a question here from Patricia. As water becomes more precious every day, is the connection between opening up the forest and loss of moisture being discussed more and more with the agencies?
I mean, in my experience, the agencies don't want to talk about the microclimate effects of removing trees from the forest. I mean, when you're removing trees, you're removing water retention capacity, fundamentally.
There's some talk of them even, not being hesitant about calling a wetland, but that's pretty recent. They're just concerned about ignoring the categorization of areas that would be protected.
Awesome. We have a question here from Grant. Is the barred owl removal a desirable means of controlling spotted owl depredation? I believe I said that word correct. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think answer that. So it can be effective to remove barred owls, and that might help spotted owls because there's competition, mostly not so much depredation by barred owls on spotted owls, but more competition, taking the as for old forests are cut and there's less and less of the mature old forests, and barred owls are more generalist and they can inhabit old growth forests as well as more open forests. They eat more different things, and so they can outcompete the spotted owl. And so there have been recent efforts to remove barred owls. We can say remove, but it really means shoot them and get rid of them. And it has been effective in bringing in allowing spotted owls to move back into some of these areas. But whether or not it's desirable is maybe a matter of personal opinion, but it can be effective in helping spotted owls.
Awesome. Okay. This is just a comment from Spencer. He's saying that really interested in scientific references that can be used to refute recent efforts to log in certain forests with management benefits. Spencer, if you are interested in those materials, you can find them at all 3 of our websites, the John Muir Project, oh my gosh,
Nature Institute.
Thank you. Wild Nature Institute just had a giant brain fart. And then Maya has her own website as well, under her poet laureate name, Maya Khosla. And all of those will be referenced in our follow-up materials, and we can all panelists will be happy to provide some more citations for you that we can
Absolutely.
help supply, because any effort to stop logging is something that we fully support, definitely at JMP. So I will happily pass along those references for you. And then with that, everyone, I think we are rounding out the time that we have allotted for our webinar today. But again, the webinar will be fully recorded. It will be uploaded on our YouTube channel within a day or two. The follow-up materials will be sent, and any questions that we didn't get to in our chat will be sent with a written response to everyone. So I just want to say thank you again to our wonderful panelists. It was wonderful to have you, and also to all our participants for showing up today. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.